Glad you're here, because tonight's tale is too strange to read alone. Picture this. You're standing in a vineyard in northern Italy, and it's December 1539. The sun beats down on your shoulders with the intensity of a July afternoon sweat beating on your forehead as you stare at grapevines that should be dormant but are instead budding with new growth. The air shimmers with heat waves that belong 6 months in the future, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a cold dread settles in because you absolutely know that something is terribly wrong with the world. You're about to experience the most catastrophic year in European history, a 12-month nightmare that will make our modern heat waves look like gentle spring days. The year 1540 wasn't just hot, it was apocalyptic. It was the kind of heat that turned rivers into walking paths, made wine cheaper than water, and killed 1 million people across a continent. You probably won't survive this, but then again, most people didn't. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment, letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing this little community we've built together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The winter that should have been your salvation has become your first warning. Here in northern Italy, where you've made your home in a small farming village outside Milan, the months that should bring relief from summer's heat have instead brought more of the same. October came and went without a single drop of rain. November passed in a haze of unseasonable warmth. December arrived with temperatures that made you question whether the calendar makers had made some cosmic error. You watch your neighbors' faces grow more worried with each passing day. Old Giuseppe, who's seen 70 winters, keeps muttering that in all his years, he's never witnessed anything like this. The olive groves that should be resting are pushing out new shoots, confusing the trees into thinking spring has arrived 4 months early. Your own small vegetable garden, which you'd prepared for winter dormancy, is instead producing a second harvest of tomatoes and herbs, a blessing that feels more like a curse. The absence of rain has become the village's obsession. Every morning, you join the other villagers in scanning the horizon for clouds, searching for any sign that the natural order might restore itself. But day after day, the sky remains a brilliant mocking blue. The sun rises with the same relentless intensity, and the heat builds through the day until evening brings only mild relief, not the crisp coolness that should herald winter's approach. Water levels in the local wells have begun to drop noticeably. The miller's wheel, which has turned steadily for generations, now operates only during the brief periods when the stream carries enough water to power it. You've started rationing your own water usage, though you're not quite sure why some instinct tells you that worse times are coming, even though you can't imagine what could be worse than this endless, unnatural heat. The most disturbing sight is the wildlife. Birds that should have migrated south months ago remain in the area as confused as everyone else about what season it's supposed to be. Hibernating animals emerge from their winter shelters only to find a world that offers no clear guidance about what they should be doing. Even the insects seem bewildered with summer species still active alongside those that typically appear only in spring. Your evening conversations with neighbors have taken on an increasingly desperate tone, Some blame witches or demons for the unnatural weather. Others whisper about divine punishment for the sins of humanity. A few of the more learned villagers speak of ancient texts that describe similar phenomena, though none can agree on what those texts actually predicted would happen next. The local priest has begun holding special prayers for rain, but even these feel hollow when delivered under a blazing sun that seems to mock any attempt at appealing to higher powers. You find yourself wondering if God has simply forgotten about your small corner of the world, leaving you all to face whatever comes next without divine intervention. As January approaches, you realize that this isn't just an unusually warm winter, it's the beginning of something unprecedented. The heat that should have been a brief anomaly has become your new reality, and you're starting to understand that the coming year will test every assumption you've ever had about how the world works. The first signs of true catastrophe begin to reveal themselves as March 1540 arrives with the intensity of a midsummer day. You're no longer in Italy. The rumors of better conditions to the north have drawn you and thousands of others into the heart of Central Europe, where German and Swiss villages promise cooler temperatures and more reliable water sources. But as you trudge through what should be the tail end of winter, you realize you've walked directly into the mouth of disaster. Your throat feels perpetually dry, now a constant reminder that something fundamental has shifted in the natural order. The village well that served your new community for centuries produces only a trickle of brackish water each morning, and by midday, even that has disappeared. You watch the local miller stare helplessly at his motionless wheel, the stream that once powered it, now reduced to a series of stagnant pools that shrink visibly each day. The sound of dying livestock has become the soundtrack of your daily existence. Cattle low mournfully in fields where grass has withered to brown stubble, their ribs showing through dull coats as farmers struggle to find enough water for both animals and humans. You've seen grown men weep as they lead their prize oxen to early slaughter, unable to maintain herds that represent generations of careful breeding and family wealth. Water has become more precious than gold, and you've learned to hoard every drop with the desperation of a miser counting coins. The morning ritual of checking the communal well has become a tense gathering where neighbors eye each other with growing suspicion. Arguments break out over who gets to draw water first, and you've witnessed friendships of decades crumble over accusations of taking more than one's fair share. The forest around your village tells its own story of devastation. Ancient oaks that have weathered countless droughts now drop their leaves in defeat, their massive trunks showing stress cracks that spider up toward branches that grow more brittle each day. The undergrowth has disappeared entirely, leaving the forest floor as bare as a swept courtyard. Even the mushrooms, those reliable harbingers of moisture, have vanished completely. Your daily search for water has become an increasingly desperate endeavor. You join groups of villagers who venture farther and farther from home, following rumors of springs or hidden streams that might have escaped the drought's grip. These expeditions often end in disappointment, leading to dried creek beds or springs that produce nothing but cracked earth and the bones of animals that died seeking the same relief you're pursuing. The psychological toll of constant thirst has begun to affect everyone's behavior. Children cry more frequently, their tears seeming especially precious in a world where moisture of any kind has become rare. Adults snap at each other with increasing frequency, their patience worn thin by the relentless heat and the gnawing anxiety about what tomorrow might bring. Historians still argue whether the drought's effects were uniform across all of Central Europe, or if some regions experienced brief periods of relief. But from your perspective, there's no debate this is universal suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. Every traveler who arrives brings news of similar conditions from distant villages, creating a growing awareness that this isn't a local problem, but a continental catastrophe. The ingenious water conservation methods that emerge from desperation would be admirable if they weren't so heartbreaking. You've learned to wash with sand instead of water, to collect the morning dew from leaves using cloth, and to strain drinking water through charcoal and gravel to make even the murkiest puddle somewhat palatable. These techniques born from necessity represent humanity's remarkable ability to adapt even when adaptation means accepting a dramatically reduced standard of living. Religious fervor has intensified as people search for meaning in their suffering. Special masses are held daily with prayers specifically dedicated to bringing rain. Some villagers have begun extreme acts of penance, believing that divine intervention requires extraordinary demonstrations of faith. You've seen people walking barefoot across burning hot stones, flagellating themselves in public squares, and fasting to the point of collapse, all in hopes of appeasing whatever cosmic forces have brought this drought upon the land. The economic implications of the water shortage are becoming increasingly clear. Trades that depend on water brewing, dyeing, milling have ground to a halt. The social hierarchy that once seemed permanent has begun to shift as traditional sources of wealth and power become irrelevant in the face of universal scarcity. A nobleman's gold cannot conjure water from an empty well, and a merchant's connections mean nothing when there are no goods to trade. As April approaches, you realize that what you initially thought was the peak of the crisis was merely the beginning. The heat continues to intensify, the water sources continue to dwindle, and the growing desperation of your fellow survivors suggests that the true test of human endurance is yet to come. By May 1540, you find yourself doing something that would have been unimaginable just months earlier, walking across the Rhine River without getting your feet wet. The mighty waterway that has served as Europe's great highway for centuries now lies before you as a series of muddy channels separated by expanses of cracked earth that crunch beneath your boots like broken pottery. You're not alone in this surreal journey. Hundreds of people traverse what was once the riverbed, their faces a mixture of wonder and terror as they navigate around the skeletons of long sunken boats and the foundations of bridges that were built to span water, not air. Children dart between the exposed pilings, treating this apocalyptic landscape like a playground, while their parents exchange worried glances and mutter prayers under their breath. The most bizarre treasure hunt in European history has begun around you. Word has spread that the dried riverbeds contain Roman coins, lost cargo from merchant vessels, and artifacts from civilizations that flourished when these waters ran deep and strong. You watch grown men and women crawling through the mud with their hands sifting through centuries of accumulated silt in search of anything valuable. Some have found ancient weapons, others discover pottery shards, and a few lucky souls have indeed uncovered silver denarii that haven't seen sunlight since the days of Caesar. The economic implications of Europe's rivers becoming walkable paths are staggering. The entire continental trade system has collapsed overnight. Barges that once carried goods from the North Sea to the Alps now sit stranded like beached whales, their hulls baking in the sun while their cargo rots in the heat. You've seen merchants weeping beside their vessels, watching fortunes in grain and wine transform into worthless spoiled remnants of a functioning economy. Rhine boatmen whose families have navigated these waters for generations now wander the dry channels like lost souls. Their intimate knowledge of currents and depths has become useless information in a world where water no longer flows. Many have taken to guiding treasure hunters through the riverbed using their expertise to identify the deepest former channels where the most valuable artifacts might be buried. The Elbe River tells the same story of aquatic death. You've heard reports from travelers that entire sections of this once mighty waterway can be crossed on foot, with people walking from bank to bank across areas that previously required ferries. The psychological impact of seeing these geographical constants reduced to dusty paths cannot be overstated. It's as if the fundamental rules of reality have been suspended. Historians still argue whether all major European rivers experienced complete drying or if some maintained minimal flow, but from your perspective trudging across the Rhine's exposed bed, the academic debate feels irrelevant. What matters is that the liquid highways that connected European civilization have vanished, leaving behind a fragmented continent where communication and commerce have become exponentially more difficult. The wildlife situation in these dried riverbeds has become both fascinating and disturbing. Fish that once swam in deep water now lie scattered across the mud in various stages of decomposition, creating a smell that forces you to breathe through your mouth when the wind shifts. But more interesting are the discoveries of animals that have been buried in the sediment for decades or centuries, complete skeletons of deer, wild boar, and even the occasional human remains that tell stories of long ago tragedies. Enterprising individuals have begun establishing riverbed markets where people trade the artifacts they've discovered. You've watched a man exchange a perfectly preserved Roman helmet for a week's worth of bread, while another trader offers medieval jewelry in return for a few precious cups of clean water. These impromptu economies represent humanity's remarkable ability to create commerce, even in the midst of catastrophe. The religious interpretations of the dried rivers have become increasingly apocalyptic. Preachers stand on what were once riverbanks, pointing to the empty channels as evidence of divine judgment. Some quote biblical passages about rivers running dry in the end times, while others insist that God is revealing hidden treasures to reward the faithful. The fact that people are literally walking on paths that water once covered has given rise to comparisons with biblical miracles, though these feel more like curses than blessings. Navigation has become a challenge that would be comical if it weren't so tragic. Road systems were built assuming that certain rivers would always require bridges or ferries, but now you can walk directly across areas where established routes make unnecessary detours. Maps have become unreliable, and travelers must constantly adapt their routes based on the changing reality of what paths are actually passable. The sound of your footsteps echoing across the empty Rhine, carries a melancholy that seems to summarize the entire disaster. Each step represents a defeat of the natural order, a violation of geographical constants that have shaped European civilization for millennia. As you reach the far bank and climb back onto solid ground, you realize that crossing Europe's great rivers on foot has become a symbol of humanity's entry into uncharted territory, both literally and figuratively. The acrid smell of smoke has become your constant companion, a bitter reminder that the drought has transformed Europe into a tinderbox where the slightest spark can ignite catastrophe. You wake each morning to a sky painted in shades of orange and gray, the sun a dim red disk, struggling to penetrate the haze that has settled over the continent like a funeral shroud. The first major fire you witness begins innocently enough. A spark from a blacksmith's forge catches on some unusually dry thatch in a village outside Strasbourg. Within hours, you watch helplessly as the flames leap from building to building with a hunger that seems almost alive. The fire moves faster than people can run, consuming entire neighborhoods in minutes, while desperate residents flee with whatever possessions they can carry. What strikes you most about these infernos is their sound, not just the crackling of burning wood, but the deeper, more ominous roar that comes when fire reaches a certain intensity. It's a sound that seems to come from the earth itself, a primal growl that speaks of forces beyond human control. The screams of people and animals blend with this roar to create a symphony of destruction that haunts your dreams. The smoke has become so thick in some regions that you can barely see 20 feet ahead. Your eyes water constantly, and you've developed a persistent cough that you share with everyone else, trying to navigate this apocalyptic landscape. The air tastes of ash and desperation, with occasional hints of what's burning, sometimes wood, sometimes grain, sometimes things you prefer not to identify. Forest fires rage with an intensity that defies belief. You've seen flames climb 100-foot trees in seconds, turning ancient woodlands into towering columns of fire that can be seen for miles. The Black Forest, once a dense canopy of green that provided timber for half of Europe, now exists as a hellscape of charred stumps and smoldering undergrowth. Walking through these burned areas feels like traversing an alien planet where nothing familiar remains. The wildlife fleeing these fires has created its own form of chaos. Deer, wild boar, wolves, and bears stream out of burning forests in confused panic, sometimes running directly through human settlements. You've witnessed the surreal sight of natural enemies, predators, and prey running side by side, their instinctive behaviors, overridden by the universal need to escape the flames. Some animals, driven mad by smoke and heat, attack anything in their path, turning forest refugees into unexpected threats. City fires present their own unique horror. The narrow streets and wooden buildings of medieval urban centers create perfect conditions for fires to spread rapidly from structure to structure. You've seen entire city blocks vanish in less than an hour, their inhabitants streaming out in rivers of human misery. The sight of a cathedral's massive wooden roof collapsing in a shower of sparks and burning timber represents more than just property damage. It's the destruction of community identity and spiritual anchor points. Historians still argue whether the fires of 1540 were primarily caused by the drought conditions, or if human activities contributed significantly to the ignition frequency. But when you're running from walls of flame, the academic distinction feels meaningless. What matters is that fire has become the dominant force, reshaping the European landscape, turning familiar territories into unrecognizable wastelands. The psychological impact of living under constant threat of fire has transformed entire communities. People no longer make long-term plans or invest in permanent structures, knowing that everything could be reduced to ash without warning. You've noticed that conversations have become shorter, more urgent, as if everyone understands that time itself has become a precious commodity that could be snatched away at any moment. Firefighting efforts, while brave, are largely futile in the face of such overwhelming conflagrations. Bucket brigades form spontaneously when fires threaten populated areas, but the lack of water makes these attempts tragically ineffective. You've participated in several such efforts, passing containers of precious water from hand to hand, only to watch the flames consume buildings faster than the liquid can be applied. The economic destruction caused by these fires is incalculable. Entire harvests disappear in minutes' workshops, and their tools vanish overnight, and years of accumulated wealth transform into worthless ash. You've met craftsmen who've lost not just their businesses, but the specialized knowledge and tools that represented generations of family tradition. The cultural continuity that binds communities together is being severed by flames that care nothing for human achievement or historical significance. Some people have begun to develop an almost supernatural ability to predict where fires will strike next. They read the wind patterns, observe the dryness of vegetation, and seem to sense when conditions are about to turn critical. These informal fire prophets have become valuable community resources, their warnings often providing the only advance notice that allows people to escape with their lives. The nights offer no relief from the constant threat. You've learned to sleep lightly, always ready to grab essential possessions and run. The horizon glows with distant fires, creating an eerie twilight that never truly becomes dark. Even when exhaustion finally claims you, your dreams are filled with smoke and flames, ensuring that even unconsciousness provides no escape from the burning world around you. The tavern keeper's announcement sounds like a joke until you realize he's completely serious. Wine 2 copper coins per jug, water 5 copper coins per cup. You're standing in what was once a prosperous market town in the Rhine Valley, watching the fundamental laws of economics collapse under the weight of unprecedented scarcity. The barrel of wine behind him represents abundance, while the small pot of muddy water beside it has become more precious than gold. This inversion of value has created one of history's most bizarre economic bubbles. Vineyard owners, who should be celebrating their good fortune, instead watch with growing horror as their customers drink themselves to death on what was meant to be a luxury product. The wine that flows freely from their cellars has become a substitute for the most basic necessity of life, transforming their blessing into a curse that haunts their conscience. You witness your first alcohol-related death on a Tuesday morning in late June. A middle-aged farmer, driven by thirst and the twisted logic of drought economics, has consumed nothing but wine for 3 days straight. His body, already weakened by heat and dehydration, cannot process the constant influx of alcohol. He collapses in the town square, his skin flushed red, mumbling incoherently about rivers of wine before falling into a coma from which he never awakens. The stories reaching your ears from across the region paint a picture of continental madness. In Alsace, supposedly entire communities have fallen into drunken stupors, their members too intoxicated to perform basic tasks like tending fires or caring for livestock. Some villages have reportedly lost half their population not to the drought directly, but to the alcohol poisoning that comes from substituting wine for water in their daily consumption. The quality of available wine has become irrelevant in this new economy. Vintages that would normally age for decades are being consumed immediately, their complex flavors wasted on people who drink them purely for hydration. You've seen rare bottles from renowned vineyards being gulped down like common ale, their subtle characteristics lost on palates that taste only desperation and the burning need for liquid. Children present a particularly tragic aspect of this crisis. Too young to understand why their parents offer them wine instead of water, they develop a tolerance for alcohol that transforms childhood into a hazy, confused experience. You've encountered entire families where the youngest members stumble through their days in various states of intoxication, their development permanently altered by circumstances beyond their comprehension. The religious implications of this situation have created theological debates that would be fascinating if they weren't so tragic. Priests struggle to reconcile the sacramental significance of wine with its new role as a survival necessity. Some argue that consuming wine for hydration rather than spiritual purposes represents a form of blasphemy, while others contend that God has provided wine as a merciful alternative to death by thirst. Historians still argue whether the reports of people drinking themselves to death on wine are exaggerated accounts or accurate descriptions of a genuine phenomenon. But from your perspective, watching neighbors succumb to alcohol poisoning, the academic debate feels irrelevant. The human cost of this economic inversion is playing out in real time around you, measured in lives lost to a substance that should bring joy, not death. The wine merchants have found themselves in an impossible position. Their traditional role as purveyors of celebration and luxury has been replaced by the grim reality of serving a population that views their product as a slightly less fatal alternative to dehydration. Many have begun diluting their wine with whatever water they can find, creating weak mixtures that provide some hydration while reducing the alcohol content to potentially survivable levels. The famous Würzburg wine that the document mentioned has become legendary even in these dark times. Word spreads that vintners have created special ornate barrels to contain what they're calling Millennium wine, a vintage produced under such extreme conditions that it may never be replicated. These containers, crafted with extra care and decorated with intricate carvings, represent an attempt to find meaning and beauty in the midst of catastrophe. The social dynamics of wine consumption have shifted dramatically. Taverns that once served as gathering places for evening relaxation now operate as desperate hydration stations where people arrive at dawn seeking liquid to sustain them through another day. The jovial atmosphere of traditional drinking has been replaced by grim efficiency, with customers consuming their wine quickly and leaving to make room for others. The physiological effects of sustained wine consumption on a dehydrated population create their own form of suffering. You've observed people developing a particular type of headache that seems to combine hangover symptoms with heat exhaustion, creating a persistent pain that makes every aspect of daily life more difficult. Their skin takes on a peculiar pallor, and their movements become unsteady in ways that suggest more than simple intoxication. Pregnant women face an impossible choice between death by dehydration and potential harm to their unborn children from alcohol consumption. You've witnessed the agony of expectant mothers trying to calculate the lesser of two evils, their faces reflecting the cruel mathematics of survival in a world where every option carries terrible consequences. The psychological impact of replacing water with wine has created a population that exists in a constant state of mild intoxication and severe anxiety. Decision making becomes impaired, conflicts escalate more quickly, and the social fabric that holds communities together begins to fray under the influence of alcohol and desperation. Even simple tasks become complicated when performed by people whose judgment has been compromised by their only available source of hydration. The cherry tree in front of your temporary shelter has lost its mind. You're staring at branches that should be bearing fruit in their proper season, but instead display the impossible sight of both ripe red cherries and fresh white blossoms on the same limb. It's July now, and this tree has already provided one full harvest in May, a harvest that came 2 months early and left everyone wondering if they were witnessing a miracle or a curse. The agricultural calendar that has governed human civilization for millennia has been thrown into chaos around you. Farmers who have inherited generations of planting wisdom find their knowledge worthless in a world where seasons no longer follow predictable patterns. You watch seasoned agriculturalists standing in their fields with expressions of complete bewilderment, holding seeds in their hands while staring at soil that defies every rule they've ever learned. The early grain harvest in May created scenes that border on the surreal. In the Tyrolean valleys, you witnessed farmers cutting wheat that should have needed another 3 months to mature the stalks golden and ready, despite being planted only months earlier. The grain itself, while abundant, has an unusual quality, smaller kernels, but intensely concentrated flavor, as if the compressed growing season has forced the plants to pack their essence into a shortened time frame. What makes this agricultural insanity even more remarkable is that many crops are producing second harvests. The fields that were cleared in May have been replanted and are now showing signs of another mature crop by September. You've participated in this unprecedented double growing season, helping farmers who can barely believe their good fortune, even as they worry about what such unnatural abundance might mean for the future. The fruit trees have become particularly confused by the scrambled seasons. Apple orchards that flowered in March are now producing fruit in July, while simultaneously preparing for a second flowering that should occur next spring. You've eaten apples that taste different from any you've experienced before, more intense, almost fermented from the heat, with flavors that seem to capture the desperation of the year itself. Vegetable gardens have become experimental laboratories where normal growing cycles no longer apply. You've seen tomato plants that produce continuously throughout the summer, never seeming to exhaust themselves despite the lack of water. Root vegetables like carrots and turnips grow to unusual sizes, though their texture becomes woody and strange. Even the herbs have adapted, concentrating their essential oils until they're almost too potent to use in normal quantities. The beekeepers report the strangest phenomenon of all their hives are producing honey with flavors that don't match any known flowers, as if the bees are visiting blossoms that exist only in this climate-altered reality. The honey itself has an unusual color, darker and more amber than typical, with a taste that combines sweetness with an underlying bitterness that seems to reflect the year's trauma. Historians still argue whether the reports of double harvests were widespread across Europe or limited to specific microclimates, but from your perspective, helping to gather grain for the second time in a single year, the phenomenon feels universal. Every farming community you encounter has similar stories of crops that refuse to follow traditional patterns, as if nature itself has abandoned the rules that once made agriculture predictable. The economic implications of these unusual harvests create both opportunity and anxiety. Farmers who manage to achieve double crops find themselves with surplus grain and fruit, but the collapse of trade networks means they have no way to sell their abundance to regions that might need it. You've seen granaries overflowing with wheat while neighboring areas suffer from famine, the broken transportation system preventing the redistribution that could save lives. The quality of these heat-stressed crops has become a subject of intense debate. While yields are surprisingly high, the nutritional content seems altered. Bread made from the early harvest grain has a different texture and doesn't seem to provide the same sustained energy as normal wheat. Fruits, while abundant, spoil more quickly and sometimes cause digestive problems when consumed in large quantities. The psychological impact of witnessing nature's confusion has created a population that no longer trusts the fundamental cycles of life. Farmers plant seeds without confidence that normal growing patterns will apply. Families preserve food with uncertainty about whether traditional preservation methods will work with these climate-altered crops. The reliability that agriculture has provided for human civilization has been replaced by constant adaptation and anxiety. Animals have also been affected by the scrambled growing seasons. Livestock that normally graze on pastures with predictable nutrition now encounter grasses and herbs that have developed unusual chemical compositions. Cows produce milk with a different taste, and chickens lay eggs that seem smaller but more intensely flavored. Even wild animals appear confused by the abundance of food appearing at unexpected times. The religious interpretations of these agricultural miracles have divided communities. Some see the double harvests as divine providence, God's way of providing sustenance during the drought. Others view the unnatural growing patterns as signs of apocalyptic times, evidence that the natural order has been fundamentally corrupted. Priests struggle to provide guidance when the evidence suggests that normal patterns of divine providence no longer apply. The seed-saving traditions that ensure future harvests have become complicated by uncertainty about whether seeds from these unusual crops will produce normal plants in future years. Farmers carefully preserve seeds from both harvests, but with deep anxiety about whether they're saving genetic material that will prove viable when normal weather returns, assuming it ever does. The smell hits you first, a sweet, cloying stench that seems to coat the inside of your nostrils and refuse to leave. It's the smell of human decomposition accelerated by relentless heat, an odor that has become the unofficial perfume of European cities during this summer of death. You pull your cloth mask higher over your nose, but it provides little protection against the reality that surrounds you. Bodies are piling up faster than they can be buried. Walking through what was once a thriving market town near Frankfurt, you count 17 corpses before you stop keeping track. They lie in doorways collapsed against walls, sprawled in the dust of what used to be busy streets. Most died of dehydration, their bodies mummified by the heat into grotesque sculptures that barely resemble the living people they once were. Their skin has taken on a leathery texture, pulled tight over bones that protrude at sharp angles. The death toll has reached numbers that defy comprehension. 1 million people, that's the estimate whispered among survivors, though no one can verify such a figure when entire record-keeping systems have collapsed along with the communities they once served. You've stopped asking about specific individuals because the answer is almost always the same: dead, missing, or fled to regions that probably offer no better prospects for survival. Children's bodies affect you most deeply, their small forms scattered throughout the urban wasteland like broken dolls. They succumbed faster than adults, their smaller bodies unable to cope with dehydration and heat exposure for extended periods. You've seen mothers sitting beside tiny corpses, too weak or traumatized to move their minds, shattered by losses that exceed the human capacity for grief. The morgues and cemeteries overflowed weeks ago, forcing communities to develop emergency disposal methods that would have been unthinkable during normal times. Mass graves appear on the outskirts of towns, hastily dug pits where bodies are deposited without ceremony or individual identification. The sacred rituals of burial have been abandoned in favor of simple sanitary necessity. Some cities have resorted to burning their dead in massive pyres that add their smoke to the already choking atmosphere. You've witnessed these funeral fires watching as entire families disappear into flames that seem to merge with the wildfire smoke that perpetually obscures the horizon. The religious implications of cremation, traditionally forbidden in Christian Europe, have been overwhelmed by the practical necessity of preventing disease outbreaks. The survivors you encounter have developed a peculiar psychological numbness to death. People step over corpses with the same casual indifference they once reserved for puddles or fallen branches. Children play games around dead bodies, their young minds adapting to horror with a resilience that is both impressive and deeply disturbing. This normalization of mortality represents a fundamental shift in how an entire generation will understand life and death. Historians still argue whether the death toll of 1540 approached the million-person estimate, or if the numbers have been exaggerated by traumatized chroniclers. But from your perspective, walking through cities where the living are outnumbered by the dead, statistical accuracy feels irrelevant. The human cost is measured not just in numbers, but in the complete breakdown of social structures that once made civilization possible. The wealthy have not escaped this democratic disaster. You've seen noblemen's carriages abandoned beside roads, their occupants having succumbed to the same heat and thirst that killed peasants. Gold cannot purchase water that doesn't exist, and social status provides no protection against dehydration. The great equalizer of death has reduced all social hierarchies to meaningless distinctions. Disease has begun to spread among the survivors, their immune systems weakened by malnutrition and stress. Dysentery runs rampant through refugee camps, where people have gathered around the few remaining water sources. Typhoid fever and other illnesses that thrive in unsanitary conditions find perfect breeding grounds in communities where normal hygiene has become impossible to maintain. The psychological toll of constant exposure to death has created a population of walking trauma victims. People speak in monotones, their voices stripped of emotional inflection by experiences that exceed their capacity to process. You've noticed that conversations have become purely practical discussions of water sources, food availability, and shelter options, while topics that once brought joy or excitement are never mentioned. Suicide has become increasingly common as people choose death on their own terms, rather than waiting for the slow agony of dehydration. You've discovered bodies that show clear signs of self-inflicted wounds, people who decided that a quick death was preferable to the prolonged suffering that seemed to be their only alternative. These deaths carry their own particular sadness, representing the moment when hope finally died along with the body. The infrastructure of death has collapsed along with everything else. Coffin makers have no wood to work with gravediggers, lack the strength to dig in soil that has become as hard as stone, and priests have too many bodies to provide individual services for each deceased person. The rituals that once helped communities process grief have been replaced by the grim efficiency of mass disposal. Animals have joined the death toll in numbers that add to the overall sense of apocalypse. Livestock pets and wildlife create additional disposal challenges for communities already overwhelmed by human casualties. The sight of dogs and cats lying dead beside their human companions creates particularly poignant scenes that seem to summarize the completeness of this civilizational collapse. The few doctors who remain alive and functional have become overwhelmed by the scope of medical needs they cannot address. Without water for basic sanitation, medical treatment becomes largely symbolic. You've watched physicians weep beside patients. They cannot help their professional skills rendered useless by circumstances that exceed any medical training they ever received. Christmas Day, 1540, finds you standing waist-deep in the Rhine River, the water pleasantly warm against your skin, as if it were a mid-July afternoon. The surreal nature of this moment, bathing in a river during what should be the depths of winter, perfectly captures the complete breakdown of seasonal reality that has defined this extraordinary year. Around you, other bathers splash and laugh with the desperate joy of people who have witnessed too much death to take any pleasure for granted. The temperature hasn't dropped below what would normally be considered pleasant spring weather since October. You've long since packed away the heavy woolen clothing that should be essential for winter survival, replacing it with the light linens that barely seemed adequate even during the peak of summer's heat. The concept of winter clothing has become as obsolete as snowplows or ice skates in this climate-altered reality. 10 months of Mediterranean conditions in the heart of Germany have created a landscape that seems transplanted from another continent entirely. Palm trees impossibly have begun sprouting in monastery gardens where monks have been experimenting with seeds obtained from traders who normally deal only with southern regions. Olive groves that were planted as desperate experiments in early summer are actually producing fruit, their silvery leaves glinting in the endless sunshine. The absence of winter has disrupted migration patterns in ways that would be fascinating if they weren't so ominous. Birds that should have flown south months ago remain in regions where they never intended to overwinter. Flocks of species that belong in Mediterranean climates have appeared in areas where they've never been recorded, as if the entire European ecosystem is slowly sliding southward to match the new climatic reality. Agricultural communities have entered a state of complete temporal confusion. Farmers plant winter crops in what feels like spring weather, uncertain whether the seeds will respond to seasonal cues that no longer exist, or if they'll need to develop entirely new planting strategies for a world without predictable temperature cycles. The traditional farming calendar, refined over centuries of careful observation, has become a useless relic. The psychological impact of endless summer has proven more complex than you might have expected. While the absence of winter's harshness initially seemed like a blessing, the relentless heat and unvarying daylight have created a form of seasonal depression in reverse. People crave the relief that cooler weather traditionally provided, the sense of natural rhythm that helped mark the passage of time and provided psychological variety. Historians still argue whether the extended warm period of 1540 to 1541 represents the longest continuous absence of winter weather in recorded European history. But from your perspective, swimming in December, the academic classification matters less than the lived experience of inhabiting a world where fundamental assumptions about climate have been permanently altered. The economic implications of a 10-month growing season have created opportunities that feel almost obscene in the context of so much death and suffering. Regions that manage to maintain water access are producing agricultural yields that would be impossible under normal conditions. You've seen harvest festivals in November and December celebrations that feel simultaneously joyful and deeply wrong. Religious observances have been forced to adapt to a reality where traditional seasonal markers no longer exist. Christmas services, held in temperatures that would be comfortable for Easter celebrations, create theological confusion about the natural order that God supposedly established. Some priests have begun questioning whether the absence of winter represents divine mercy or divine punishment, their sermons reflecting the uncertainty that permeates every aspect of life. The wine production from this extended growing season has created vintages that will be remembered for centuries, assuming there are people left to remember them. Grapes that ripened in the unprecedented heat have produced wines with alcohol content and flavor profiles that exceed anything in human memory. These bottles, carefully preserved in cellars that remain miraculously cool, represent liquid testimony to the year when nature lost its mind. The textile industry has been forced to completely reimagine its seasonal production cycles. Workshops that normally spend winter months preparing heavy fabrics for cold weather have instead focused on ultralight materials designed to provide minimal protection from sun while allowing maximum air circulation. The entire concept of seasonal fashion has become meaningless when every day feels like high summer. Children born during this period will have no personal memory of what winter feels like, creating a generation whose understanding of natural cycles has been fundamentally altered from birth. You've watched infants and toddlers playing in December sunshine, their development shaped by climatic conditions that their parents never experienced and cannot adequately explain. The wildlife adaptations to perpetual summer have created ecological disruptions that seem to ripple through every level of the natural world. Hibernating species remain active throughout what should be their dormant period, creating population pressures and food competition that upset predator-prey relationships established over millennia. The absence of winter die-offs has led to insect populations that seem to multiply without natural checks. Water sources that should be frozen solid continue flowing, but many have become contaminated by algae blooms and bacterial growth that normally would be controlled by winter temperatures. The few remaining streams and ponds have developed a greenish tinge and smell that makes them barely suitable for consumption, even when boiled, adding another layer of complexity to the ongoing water crisis. The building materials traditionally used for winter construction have proven inadequate for extended heat exposure. Timber that should be protected by cold weather has dried and cracked beyond usability. Stone buildings absorb heat during the day and radiate it throughout the night, turning homes into ovens that provide no relief from the relentless temperature. Architecture designed for seasonal temperature variation has become actively harmful to human comfort and survival. January 1541 arrives with cherry blossoms blooming in the mountain valleys of Tyrol, their delicate pink petals drifting on warm breezes that should be carrying snowflakes. You're witnessing the complete absence of winter, not just a mild winter or an unusually warm one, but the total failure of an entire season to materialize. The calendar insists it's the depths of winter, but your sweat-dampened clothes and the buzzing insects around your head tell a different story entirely. The phenomenon you're experiencing goes beyond mere weather anomaly into something that feels like a fundamental alteration of reality itself. Winter hasn't simply been delayed or weakened, it has been erased from existence, as if the cosmic machinery that controls seasons has skipped a gear and jumped directly from autumn back to spring. The psychological impact of this temporal displacement cannot be overstated. You're living through a violation of natural law that challenges every assumption about how the world works. The absence of winter has created agricultural chaos that makes the double harvest seem simple by comparison. Farmers who planted winter wheat, expecting months of cold dormancy, now watch their crops growing actively throughout what should be their resting period. Root vegetables that require frost to develop proper sweetness remain bitter and underdeveloped. The entire agricultural system depends on winter's pause, and without it, crops are maturing at unpredictable rates with uncertain nutritional value. Animals designed for seasonal hibernation remain active, creating ecological pressures that ripple through entire food webs. Bears that should be deep in winter sleep continue foraging, depleting food sources that other wildlife depends on for survival. Squirrels and other creatures that cache food for winter consumption find themselves with surplus stores and no instinctual guidance about what to do with unexpected abundance. The human circadian rhythms evolved over millennia to sync with seasonal light, and temperature cycles have been thrown into chaos by the absence of winter's shorter days and longer nights. You've noticed that people struggle with sleep patterns, their bodies expecting seasonal cues that no longer exist. The psychological importance of winter's forced rest and reflection has been eliminated, replaced by relentless heat that demands constant activity and adaptation. Religious communities face theological crises as they attempt to celebrate winter holy days in conditions that mock the seasonal symbolism embedded in their traditions. The metaphorical darkness that makes Christmas light meaningful has been replaced by blazing sunshine that makes candles seem redundant. Priests struggle to preach about spiritual winter and renewal when the physical world provides no corresponding seasonal experience. The social rhythms that depend on winter's natural pause have completely disintegrated. Communities traditionally used winter months for indoor craft storytelling and social bonding activities that required shelter from harsh weather. Without winter's necessity for gathering indoors, these cultural practices begin to fade, potentially severing connections between generations that depend on seasonal transmission of knowledge and tradition. Historians still argue whether the complete absence of winter in 1540, 1541 represents a unique event in European climate history, or if similar phenomena occurred in periods with inadequate record keeping. But from your perspective, watching cherry trees bloom in January, the historical precedent feels less important than the immediate reality of inhabiting a world where fundamental natural cycles have ceased to function. The economic implications of a missing winter have proven both beneficial and catastrophic in different sectors. Industries that depend on winter downtime for equipment maintenance and repair find themselves operating continuously without breaks, leading to accelerated wear and unexpected failures. Conversely, construction and transportation that normally halt during winter months continue uninterrupted, creating opportunities for projects that would typically require seasonal delays. The preservation of food has become exponentially more difficult without winter's natural refrigeration. Meat that should be easily preserved in cold weather spoils rapidly in continued heat, forcing communities to consume perishables immediately or develop new preservation techniques for climatic conditions they never expected to encounter. The traditional food storage methods, refined over centuries, have become useless overnight. Water sources that should be locked in ice remain liquid but often stagnant, developing bacterial contamination that adds another dimension to the ongoing water crisis. Wells that rely on winter snowmelt for spring replenishment show no signs of recovery, their levels continuing to drop as demand persists without seasonal renewal. The hydrological cycle that depends on winter precipitation has been broken at its most fundamental level. The psychological toll of temporal displacement has created a population that exists in a state of perpetual disorientation. Without winter's natural endpoint to the year's cycle, time seems to stretch indefinitely forward without markers or boundaries. You've observed people losing track of dates and struggling to maintain mental frameworks for organizing experience when the natural world provides no seasonal structure. Children who should be learning about seasonal cycles through direct experience instead encounter a reality where adults cannot explain why their teachings about winter don't match observable conditions. Educational systems built around seasonal metaphors and examples find their foundational assumptions invalidated by a world where winter simply doesn't exist. The clothing and textile industries face complete obsolescence of their winter product lines. Workshops that spent months preparing warm garments for cold seasons find themselves with inventory that has no market value in a world where heavy coats and warm boots have become as useful as ice skates in a desert. The economic disruption extends through entire supply chains built around seasonal needs that no longer exist. Building techniques designed to provide winter shelter prove not just unnecessary, but actively harmful in continued heat. Homes built for thermal retention become suffocating ovens, while heating systems designed for cold weather create dangerous overheating when operated in summer-like conditions. The architecture of entire civilizations has been rendered inappropriate for the climatic reality they now inhabit. As you stand in the ruins of what was once a thriving European village, now reduced to ash-covered foundations and scattered bones bleaching in the relentless sun, you realize that 1540 has become more than just a year of extreme weather. It has transformed into a civilizational watershed that will echo through centuries. The magnitude of what you've witnessed goes beyond individual suffering or even mass death. It represents a fundamental break in the continuity of human experience, a moment when the reliable patterns that shaped European life for millennia simply ceased to exist. The survivors you encounter carry trauma that seems to have altered them at a cellular level. Their eyes hold a haunted quality that speaks to experiences beyond normal human endurance. They've witnessed the death of predictability itself. These people have seen rivers vanish, seasons disappear, and the basic assumptions of agricultural life proven worthless. They speak in shortened sentences, their vocabulary stripped down to essentials, because elaborate description feels meaningless after experiencing the indescribable. The cultural impact of this catastrophic year will reshape European consciousness in ways that won't become apparent for generations. Children who lived through 1540 will grow into adults who never fully trust weather patterns, who hoard water with religious intensity, and who view any summer heat wave as a potential harbinger of apocalypse. The collective trauma will be passed down through stories that seem increasingly unbelievable to future generations who inhabit a world where seasons follow predictable patterns. Scientific understanding has been simultaneously advanced and shattered by the events you've witnessed. Scholars who attempted to document and explain the phenomenon found their existing frameworks completely inadequate for describing what they observed. The careful categorizations of natural philosophy prove useless when confronted with cherry trees blooming in January and rivers that can be crossed on foot. This intellectual humility, forced by circumstances beyond theoretical comprehension, will eventually contribute to more sophisticated approaches to understanding climate and weather. The agricultural knowledge accumulated over centuries has been proven unreliable in a single year, forcing farming communities to begin rebuilding their understanding from scratch. Seed varieties that survived the heat and drought will be carefully preserved and propagated, while traditional planting schedules will be viewed with permanent suspicion. The relationship between human communities and the natural world has been fundamentally altered by the demonstration that nature can abandon its patterns without warning. Historians still argue whether 1540 represents a unique climatic event or part of a larger pattern of extreme weather that periodically disrupts European civilization. But from your perspective as a survivor, the academic classification matters less than the lived understanding that safety is an illusion and catastrophe can arrive without warning. The year has taught an entire continent that the conditions that make civilization possible are far more fragile than anyone previously imagined. The economic systems that survived the catastrophe have been permanently altered by the experience of watching traditional value systems collapse overnight. Money proved worthless when water disappeared. Social status provided no protection against dehydration, and agricultural wealth evaporated with the crops. The communities that rebuild will do so with different priorities, placing water security and climate resilience above the luxuries that once seemed important. Religious institutions face the challenge of incorporating the year's events into theological frameworks that assume divine providence operates according to comprehensible patterns. The prayers for rain that went unanswered, the masses for the dead that couldn't keep pace with mortality, and the seasonal celebrations that occurred in impossible climatic conditions have created theological questions that will require centuries to fully address. The technological innovations born from desperation during 1540 will influence European development in unexpected directions. Water conservation techniques developed during the drought food preservation methods adapted to extreme heat and agricultural practices modified for climatic uncertainty will become part of the standard knowledge base that communities pass down to future generations. Crisis has accelerated innovation in ways that peaceful times never could. The demographic impact of losing 1 million people will reshape the political and economic balance of European regions for decades. Entire bloodlines have been extinguished, taking with them not just individual lives, but accumulated knowledge, skills, and cultural traditions. The social structures that depended on stable population levels will require fundamental reorganization to function with dramatically reduced numbers. Perhaps most significantly, 1540 has demonstrated that the climatic stability that allowed European civilization to flourish is not guaranteed to continue. The year serves as a warning that the natural world operates according to patterns that can shift without regard for human needs or expectations. Future generations will look back on 1540 as the moment when Europe learned that adaptation and resilience are not optional luxuries, but essential survival skills. The memory of this year will become a touchstone for understanding human vulnerability in the face of climatic extremes. Chronicles and records will preserve the stories of those who survived and those who didn't, creating a historical resource that future climate scientists will study for insights into how societies respond to unprecedented environmental stress. The documentation of 1540 will serve as both historical record and cautionary tale for civilizations that believe themselves immune to natural catastrophe. As you prepare to leave this devastated landscape and join the streams of refugees seeking regions that might offer more sustainable living conditions, you carry with you the knowledge that you've witnessed one of history's most transformative years. The Europe you're leaving behind is fundamentally different from the one that existed before 1540. Its survivors forever changed by experiences that redefined the relationship between human ambition and natural power. The year of the Great Heat has ended, but its consequences will shape European history for centuries to come, a permanent reminder that the forces that sustain civilization are far more fragile and precious than anyone ever imagined. The gentle evening breeze carries the faint scent of rain on the horizon and for the first time in over a year, clouds are gathering in the western sky. Your heart beats faster at the sight, hope stirring in your chest like a small flame that has somehow survived the endless heat. Perhaps the natural order is finally beginning to restore itself. Perhaps the seasons will return, bringing with them the predictable cycles that make human planning possible once again. You close your eyes and listen to the wind moving through the burned remains of what was once a forest, and in that sound you hear not just the echo of destruction, but the whisper of renewal. The year 1540 has taught you that catastrophe can arrive without warning, but it has also shown you that humans possess remarkable capacity for endurance, adaptation, and hope. As you drift toward sleep, under a sky that finally shows promise of change, you hold on to both lessons, the fragility of the world you thought you knew, and the resilience that might help you build something better from its ashes. The story of the Great Heat is ending, but the story of recovery is just beginning. And perhaps in learning to survive the impossible, you've discovered something valuable about what it truly means to be human in a world where the only constant is change itself. Sleep comes easier now, carried on the whisper of wind that speaks of cooler days ahead and the patient work of rebuilding a world that understands its own vulnerability. Rest well knowing that even in the darkest times, there are always new chapters waiting to be written.